I woke to a ceiling I didn't recognize, and the first clear thought that passed through me was this: they must have believed I wouldn't wake at all. The air still smelled of anesthesia, sharp and metallic, a smell I used to know well from my years as a nurse. But this time it clung to my skin, to my breath, to the ache in my abdomen. I tried to lift my hand, but it trembled like it no longer belonged to me. 74 years in this world, and my own body had finally decided to test how much weight my spirit could carry. A young nurse, far too young to hide her worry well, leaned over me and smiled as if she'd practiced it on the way in. "Mrs. Hayes, you came through the surgery. Everything went as expected." Everything except, perhaps, the part no one wanted to say aloud. I could see it in her eyes. A hesitation, a kind of apology forming before the words even had shape. "Your family has been here," she added quietly. "Your daughter signed some papers, and someone from the court stopped by this morning." Court. That word woke me more effectively than the oxygen line across my face. I forced my voice into the air, thin and raw. "What kind of court?" She hesitated again, and that told me more than anything else could. People hesitate when they know the truth will land like a stone. "A guardianship petition," she finally whispered. "Emergency guardianship. They filed while you were still in surgery." I stared at her, but the room seemed to lean away from me. Guardianship. My own 2 children, grown, capable, healthy, had gone to a judge while I lay unconscious and told him I could not be trusted with my own life, my own home, my own name. For a moment I wondered whether I'd misheard, whether she meant insurance or advance directives or something sensible. But no. The tremor in her voice made it clear. She wasn't mistaken. "They said you were no longer able to manage your affairs," she added, softer now, almost ashamed to repeat it. "I have lived through losing a husband, raising 2 children alone, 12-hour night shifts, and the quiet kind of grief that comes with being forgotten slowly. But hearing that my own flesh and blood stood before a judge and declared me unfit, something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not with drama, just a thin, precise line, the sort that never heals the same again. "When is the hearing?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning. The judge allowed a temporary evaluation. Someone came to assess you, but you weren't fully awake." "I'm sorry." In my mind, I could already see my daughter Caroline smoothing her hair in that clipped way she does when she wants to appear composed. My son, Peter, with that stiff politeness he uses when he's speaking to people he thinks are beneath him. They would have told the judge I was confused, forgetful, alone. They would not have mentioned that I balanced my own accounts, paid every bill on time, kept my house tidy enough to meet any nurse's standard. They would not have mentioned that I had walked myself into this hospital, steady as any woman my age has the right to be. The nurse adjusted my blanket. "Is there anyone you want us to call?" Yes, there was someone, but not them. Not the ones who hoped to wrap my life in legal restraints before I had even opened my eyes. My breath came slowly, carefully, as I gathered enough strength to speak. "Yes," I said. "Call Margaret Cole, my neighbor. Tell her I need my documents brought here. All of them." The nurse nodded and hurried out, grateful, perhaps, to be done delivering the truth. Alone in the room, I let my hands rest on the sheets. They still trembled. Maybe from the anesthesia. Maybe from the betrayal. Hard to say. At my age, pain blends together until you learn to name it by texture, not by cause. I stared at the window, the daylight too bright, too indifferent, and whispered barely audibly. They think I'm done. They think I won't fight. But I was awake now, and that changed everything. By evening, the room had grown quieter, the kind of quiet that settles not from peace, but from exhaustion. A soft hum came from the hallway, carts rolling, shoes whispering against tile, voices kept low for the sake of those who were fighting battles no one could see. I lay there, listening to all of it, letting the sounds remind me I was still in the world, still breathing, still mine. It must have been close to midnight when a woman I'd never seen stepped into my room. No introduction, no warmth. Just a clipboard, a stiff jaw, and the kind of gaze people use when they're evaluating livestock before an auction. She approached the bed with quick, clipped steps. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm conducting an emergency capacity assessment," she said, without looking directly at me. "Please stay awake and respond clearly." Her voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had already decided what she wanted to find. I blinked slowly, gathering myself. "I just came out of surgery," I murmured. "Yes," she said. "All the more reason to determine your current level of function. I need to ask several questions." She positioned herself at the foot of my bed, like a judge presiding over a case that had already been won. I could feel how weak I was. My abdomen pulsed with every breath, my limbs heavy as wet cloth. It was hardly the moment to defend one's entire life. "What day is it?" she asked. The room swayed a bit. I searched for the memory, but the anesthesia still clouded my thoughts. I managed an answer, unsure if it was correct. She scribbled something. "And can you tell me your full address?" I repeated it carefully. My voice shook, but not from confusion. From anger I had not yet allowed to surface. "Still," she wrote, her eyebrow lifting slightly, as if even my correct responses were inconveniences. "Who is the current president?" I answered again. She paused, sighed softly, and glanced at her watch. "When you're home alone," she said, "do you ever feel unable to manage tasks or make decisions?" I looked straight at her. "No," I whispered. "I manage just fine. And yet your children reported increasing forgetfulness, confusion, and misplacing important documents." That made me turn colder inside. My children had been thorough. They'd prepared their story before the scalpel ever touched me. "That's not true," I said. She gave me a soft, patronizing smile, the kind used on elderly patients who insist they're fine when everyone around them claims otherwise. "Mrs. Hayes, many people your age have difficulty recognizing cognitive decline in themselves. It's normal. Normal." What an easy word people use when they want to take something from you while pretending to help. She asked a few more questions, none of them particularly meaningful, but all phrased as if the entire world balanced on my ability to answer quickly, perfectly, without the slightest hesitation, as if the fog of medication, blood loss, and pain could be interpreted only one way: incapacity. When she finished, she stood there a moment longer, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "The court will review my notes in the morning," she said. "If you have concerns, you may address them then, assuming you're well enough to attend." I didn't respond. I simply watched her walk out, neat and efficient, leaving behind the faint scent of disinfectant and inevitability. Once she was gone, I closed my eyes and breathed as deeply as my sutures allowed. There is a shame that comes with being evaluated like that, a quiet, cutting shame, even when you've done nothing to deserve it. I had spent my whole life caring for others, listening to their fears, comforting their families. And now I was the one being catalogued, judged, reduced to a list of symptoms someone else had invented for their own convenience. A faint knock touched the door. A man in scrubs peeked in. "Just checking on you, Mrs. Hayes. Need anything?" "Water," I whispered. My throat felt made of gravel. He brought it quickly, adjusting my pillows with a gentleness that nearly undid me. When he finished, he gave me a nod that felt honest, human. "They shouldn't do these assessments right after anesthesia," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It's not right." He left before I could thank him. The room settled again into its dim glow. I took a sip of water, my hands trembling less now, and set the cup aside. Tomorrow they would look at that stranger's notes. Tomorrow they would decide whether my life still belonged to me. And as the monitor beside me ticked steadily in the dark, I made myself a promise. I would walk into that courtroom, no matter the pain. I would speak for myself, because no one else in that room intended to. Morning came in slow degrees, a pale light slanting across the floor, like it was unsure whether to step inside. I hadn't slept much. Pain has its own way of marking the hours, and betrayal has an even sharper one. By the time footsteps sounded in the hallway, two pairs, familiar in their rhythm, I knew who they belonged to. A mother knows the cadence of her children, even when she wishes she didn't. Caroline entered first, polished as ever. Her hair was pulled back tight, her blouse immaculate, her expression carefully arranged into concern. Peter followed, looking tired in the way people look tired after spending a night rehearsing excuses, not offering comfort. "Mom," Caroline said, leaning over me, you look better than we expected." There was something in her tone, a small disappointment tucked beneath the sweetness. I didn't comment. I simply watched her, my silence a thing she had never learned how to read. Peter set a paper cup of coffee on the table with a clumsy attempt at gentleness. "We wanted to check on you before the hearing," he said. "Make sure you understand what's going on." Oh, I understood. Maybe not the legal tangles, not yet, but the human ones. I'd seen them forming for years. Distance disguised as busyness. Politeness used like a shield. The kind of conversations that skirt around truth the way a cat circles a puddle. Caroline glanced at the door, making sure no one else was close enough to overhear. "Mom, this isn't personal. You have to know that. We just want to make sure you're safe." "Safe from what?" I asked quietly. She hesitated. That was the first crack. She hadn't expected a direct question, not from a woman who'd been cut open less than 24 hours ago. "Well," she began, choosing each word with the precision of someone picking a path through broken glass. "You've been struggling, forgetting things, leaving the stove on. You lost your purse twice in the last month." I looked at her, letting the silence stretch. "None of that happened," I said. She blinked too quickly. Peter shifted, uncomfortable, like he'd just realized he'd boarded a boat with a leak. "Mom," he tried, "we're not accusing you of anything, but we've been worried, and the hospital said—" "The hospital said I survived surgery," I interrupted. "Everything else, someone else said for them." Peter's jaw tightened. "You have to stop making this harder than it needs to be." There it was, the truth, flaring out from under his polished calm. Caroline stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Mom, the house needs upkeep. The bills are complicated. You shouldn't be dealing with those things alone anymore. Once the guardianship is in place—" She stopped. Too late. I heard it. The slip she hadn't meant to reveal. In place, not if granted. They'd planned everything before the operation. They had expected a signature, a stamp, a clean transfer of my life into their hands. They hadn't planned for me to wake clear-minded enough to listen. "What have you done to the house?" I asked. They exchanged a glance, one of those quick sideways flashes of shared guilt. The kind siblings develop early in childhood, perfected over time. Peter exhaled sharply. "We changed the locks, only temporarily. We needed to secure things until you're stable." "You changed the locks on my home while I was in surgery," I said. "Mom, it's standard," Caroline insisted. "The court prefers—" "No." I let the words settle, firm but not loud. "The court didn't ask for that." "You did." Neither of them answered. The door swung open suddenly, and the nurse wheeled in a tray I hadn't asked for. My children stepped back, their conversation interrupted, their expressions reorganized into something more neutral. "We'll talk after the hearing," Caroline said, smoothing her blouse, as if neat fabric could cover crooked intentions. Peter lifted the coffee cup again, nudging it closer to me. "Try to stay calm, okay? It's better for everyone if we handle this smoothly." They left quickly after that, their heels clicking with a purpose I no longer mistook for love. Once the door closed, the nurse studied me with a gentle concern my children had never mastered. "Rough morning?" she asked. I nodded. She adjusted my blanket and lowered her voice. "The woman who evaluated you last night? She didn't mention your children changing the locks. That's not something the court requires." "I know," I whispered. And for the first time since waking, I felt something steady rise inside me. Not anger, not yet, but a clarity that felt like the first breath after surfacing from deep underwater. They thought I was too weak to resist, too old to understand, too sedated to fight. But I was awake now, painfully awake, and there was a hearing waiting for me. I wasn't going to face it lying down. Margaret arrived just after sunrise, her footsteps announcing her long before she reached the doorway. Even in her late 70s, she moved with the brisk certainty of a woman who had spent a lifetime in courtrooms, where hesitation was a luxury no one could afford. When she stepped into my hospital room, she didn't look at my IV lines or the bruises along my arms. She looked straight at my eyes, searching for the part of me that hadn't been cut open. "You should have called sooner," she said, setting her handbag on the chair. "But I'm here now. That's what matters." It was the first moment since waking that I felt something close to relief. "The documents," I whispered. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. "Everything from your desk drawer. Financial statements, your advance directive, the note you wrote about emergency decisions. Even the folder labeled Do Not Touch." I didn't peek. She paused, her mouth tightening. "But someone else has." I felt my pulse jump. "What do you mean?" She sat beside the bed, lowering her voice. "Your office window was unlocked. Papers were moved, subtly, but moved. I've organized too many files in my life not to notice when someone's made a mess and tried to hide it." I didn't need to guess who. My children had always preferred to cloak their intentions in good manners and tidy explanations. But rummaging through my home, my desk, that was something new. Or perhaps not new, just finally visible. "The guardianship hearing is scheduled for 9:30, Margaret said. "Emergency docket. That means they're expecting minimal resistance." I looked at my hands resting on the thin blanket. "Because they think I'm not capable." "They hope you're not," she corrected. "There's a difference." A nurse came in then, checking my vitals. She glanced at Margaret with a kind of quiet recognition, two older women reading each other's strength instinctively. When she left, the room felt sharper, the air clearer. "I won't be able to stand long," I murmured. "I'm still too weak." "You won't need to stand long," Margaret said. "You just need to show up. Capacity isn't measured by how fast you walk. It's measured by whether you understand what's being done to you." That struck something inside me, an ache deeper than the surgical wounds. I understood perfectly. Margaret unfolded the advance directive and placed it on my lap. "Do you remember signing this?" "Of course I remember," I said. "It was only a few weeks ago." "Good. Because this," she tapped the page gently, "might be the thread that unravels everything your children have done." Outside the room, a cart rolled by, rattling with metal instruments. I listened, thinking of how many times I'd pushed such carts myself, how many patients I'd reassured in the same tone nurses were now using on me. Funny how life circles back, offering you a version of yourself you barely recognize. Margaret pulled out another paper. "Now, this is the concerning part. They filed under emergency conditions. They claimed you were a danger to yourself. They submitted statements saying you were confused, unable to manage medication, forgetting conversations." A dull burn settled behind my ribs. All lies. Yes, but lies carry weight when repeated with confidence. Judges are tired. They see so many real cases of decline that they're primed to accept the familiar story. She reached for my hand. "But you have history on your side. A clean record. No incidents. Bills paid. Mail sorted. Medical appointments kept. We'll bring everything." I looked at the envelope, thick with the proof of decades lived in order and quiet responsibility. Proof that should have never been necessary. "And the assessment they forced on you last night," she continued, "isn't standard. It shouldn't have happened so soon after surgery, but it's in the file now. We can't undo that. We can only counter it." "What do we do?" I asked. Margaret stood. "First, you're getting transported to the courthouse. I already requested it. They'll bring a wheelchair." "Today?" My voice came thinner than I intended. "Yes," she said, "because if you don't attend, the judge may grant temporary guardianship by default. Your children are counting on that." I let her words settle. They didn't surprise me anymore, but they landed with the weight of truth, finally acknowledged. A soft knock interrupted us. The young nurse from earlier peeked in. "Mrs. Hayes, transport is being arranged. They'll be here in about 20 minutes." Margaret thanked her and began sorting the documents with practiced efficiency. Watching her, I felt something steady working its way back into my lungs. Resolve, maybe. Or the memory of who I used to be before my children decided to rewrite me. "You're not going to lose your life today," Margaret said without looking up. "Not if I have anything to say about it." I nodded, letting her voice anchor me. Far down the hallway, I heard the squeak of wheels approaching, the chair that would carry me into that courtroom. I wasn't ready, but I was going anyway. The courthouse smelled of old paper and cold air, the kind that seeps into your bones if you sit still too long. They wheeled me into a small waiting area outside the hearing room, and for a moment I felt like a misplaced package, labeled, assessed, and left in a corner until someone decided what to do with me. Margaret stood beside me, arms crossed, jaw set with that quiet fury only older women know how to wield without raising their voice. Through the glass panel in the door, I could see my children already inside. Caroline was smoothing her skirt, her expression tight. Peter was speaking to a clerk, gesturing with the confidence of a man who believes the world bends naturally toward him. They didn't look worried. They looked prepared. When the bailiff finally opened the door, the room fell into that heavy hush that comes when law and family collide. Margaret wheeled me forward and positioned me at the table opposite my children. I watched their faces shift, just slightly, when they realized I was awake, present, and very much aware. The judge, a gray-haired man with tired eyes, scanned the file before him. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "we're here to determine whether emergency guardianship is necessary for your protection. Your children have expressed concern about your ability to manage your daily affairs." He said it gently, but the words carried the weight of a hammer. Caroline folded her hands dramatically. "Your Honor, we love our mother deeply, but her condition has been declining. She forgets appointments, misplaces medications." "I do not," I said quietly. Peter cut in, voice strained. "She left the stove on last month. The neighbors saw smoke." "That never happened," I replied. The judge raised a hand. "Let each party speak in turn." Margaret leaned down and whispered, "Let them dig their own hole." I nodded. My children continued, listing moments manufactured to sound like evidence. Missed phone calls became confusion. Asking for help moving a heavy box was transformed into physical instability. Their script was polished, complete, almost elegant in its deception. I listened without interrupting. Sometimes silence is the sharpest blade. When they finally stopped, the judge turned to the evaluator's notes, the ones written while anesthesia still clung to my brain like fog. His brow furrowed as he read, but he said nothing. "Not yet." "Mrs. Hayes," he said at last, "do you wish to make a statement?" I lifted my chin just a little. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand my finances. I manage my home. I do not forget my medications. I do not wander or confuse names or lose myself in my own neighborhood. What I am recovering from," I touched my abdomen, "is surgery, not incompetence." My voice was thin, but steady. He listened. Margaret slid forward the documents she had gathered. Bank statements in perfect order, utility bills paid on time, lists of appointments attended, proof of a functional, structured life. The judge took his time reviewing them. Caroline shifted, fingers tightening around her purse strap. Peter cleared his throat too loudly, earning a glance from the bailiff. Then the judge spoke again, more slowly now. "There is a discrepancy here. The petition suggests long-term decline, yet these records show consistent management." Caroline leaned forward quickly. "Because she hides it, Your Honor. Mom has always been proud." A small sadness moved through me at that. Proud? Perhaps, but not foolish. The judge sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "We will continue momentarily," he said. "I need to review one more document." He reached into the file, but not the one my children had supplied. The one Margaret had placed on top, my advance directive. His face changed, subtly but unmistakably, a flicker of something like surprise. He looked up. "Mrs. Hayes, you signed this recently?" "Yes," I said. And though no one else understood what that meant yet, I could feel the shift in the room, the first crack forming in their perfectly built case. The judge wasn't ready to question them, not yet. But the question was coming. The judge adjusted his glasses, holding my advance directive as if it were a stone he hadn't expected to find in his pocket. My children leaned forward at the same time, their confidence faltering for the first time since this process began. They hadn't anticipated that document. They hadn't even known it existed. This was signed 3 weeks prior to surgery, the judge murmured, reading more closely. It names an agent for medical and legal decisions in the event of incapacity. Caroline forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Yes, Your Honor, that's why we're here. We're her children, naturally. No, the judge said, raising a hand. It does not name either of you. The room changed temperature, not literally, but in the way a storm makes the air shift before the first drop falls. Peter blinked. I'm sorry? Who else would she? But the judge had already read the name aloud. Margaret Cole. My daughter's face went pale in a way no makeup could disguise. My son sat back, shoulders rigid. They didn't look at Margaret. They didn't dare. They looked only at me, as if seeing someone they'd miscalculated, someone who had slipped out of the cage they were so certain they'd built. The judge continued, his tone now sharper, more alert. This directive states that Mrs. Hayes understood her wishes clearly at the time of signing. It also includes a note explicitly requesting that any petition for guardianship be reviewed with this document in mind. Margaret said nothing. She didn't need to. Everything she'd done for me in the past week, every quiet decision, every line she'd drawn, was now standing in that room without lifting its voice. Peter tried again, leaning forward, desperation fraying the edges of his voice. Your Honor, we didn't know about this. She must have been confused, misled. The judge interrupted. The signature is witnessed and notarized. Caroline swallowed hard. But she didn't tell us. Why wouldn't she tell us? There it was, the honest question, finally spoken, not because they cared, because they were afraid. The judge tapped the directive once, lightly, as if weighing the sound. Before I go further, I want to ask a direct question. He looked straight at me. Mrs. Hayes, when you signed this document, did you do so willingly and with full understanding of its meaning? Yes, I said. I wanted someone I trust to protect my wishes. And that person is not your children? I let the silence settle before answering. No, Your Honor, it isn't. Something inside me steadied as I said it. Not triumph, not bitterness, but a quiet recognition of the truth I had lived with for years. The judge nodded slowly, leaning back. Then I must reconsider the basis of this petition. Emergency guardianship requires evidence of harm, incapacity, or risk. At present, all I see are allegations unsupported by documentation. Caroline's voice cracked. But she's not the same, Your Honor. She's weaker. She's forgetful. I am recovering from surgery, I said calmly. Peter's hand tightened around the edge of the table. We're trying to help her. No, Margaret said for the first time, her voice low and clear. You're trying to control her. The judge cleared his throat. I will ask one more question. He looked at my children now, not unkindly, but without the indulgence they had expected. Why was the petition filed while their mother was in surgery? Both of them froze. It was the question they didn't prepare for, the one they never imagined would be asked in a room where they expected only agreement. Peter opened his mouth first, but whatever excuse he intended died before it formed. Caroline tried to recover, voice thin and defensive. We thought it was the safest time, Your Honor. She wouldn't be stressed by the process. The judge stared at them for several seconds, long enough for their explanation to collapse under its own weight. Then he set the file aside. I've heard enough, he said. Margaret placed a hand gently on the back of my wheelchair, grounding me, and I exhaled slowly, feeling that thin thread inside me pull tighter, stronger. The hearing wasn't over. There were still procedures, signatures, formalities ahead, but the balance had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. The judge lifted the advance directive again, studying it with the quiet concentration of a man who had finally found the thread that explained the entire unraveling. My children watched him with a shared, dawning fear, like two people discovering the ground beneath them was not stone, but thin, cracking ice. "Given this document," the judge said, tapping the corner, "the court must defer to the agent designated by Mrs. Hayes unless evidence proves she is incapable of fulfilling the role." His gaze moved to Margaret. Peter's mouth fell open slightly. Caroline stiffened so sharply, her necklace shifted against her collarbone with a soft click. "Your Honor," Caroline said, her voice trembling with the effort to stay controlled. "This makes no sense. She barely knows Margaret." "We've lived next door to each other for 23 years, Margaret said evenly. "Your mother asked for my help because she trusted me not to interfere with her independence." Caroline blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the simple truth. "But we're her children." "And yet," Margaret replied, "you filed for guardianship without her consent, changed the locks on her home, and attempted to restrict her access to her own property." The judge looked at my children again, this time with a deeper gravity. "Is that accurate?" Silence. A silence that said more than any denial could. Finally, Peter muttered, "We were trying to protect her." "From what?" the judge asked. "The surgery she consented to? The home she maintains? The bank accounts she manages without error?" No answer. The judge leaned back, shoulders relaxing as if the entire puzzle had finally arranged itself. "This petition claims urgent risk," he said. "But I see no evidence of risk, only assertions contradicted by financial records, medical documentation, and this advance directive." He closed the file with a deliberate, final sound. "I am denying the petition in full." Caroline gasped softly. Peter's jaw clenched, his face darkening as the meaning settled over him. Not only had they failed, but the failure was now a matter of public record. My heart, weak as it was, steadied itself against my ribs. The judge continued, "Furthermore, I am issuing a temporary protection order preventing either petitioner from accessing Mrs. Hayes's property, accounts, or personal documents until the matter is fully reviewed." It was not vengeance. It was justice catching up to the truth. "Your Honor," Peter tried, but the judge held up his hand. "The court takes attempts at inappropriate guardianship very seriously. You may not use the legal system as a means to override a competent adult's autonomy." Caroline's composure finally cracked. Her voice came thin, almost pleading. "We thought we were doing the right thing." The judge sighed, not cruelly, but with the weary understanding of a man who had seen this story too many times. "Mrs. Hayes is the only person in this room who has not attempted to speak over someone else's life. Perhaps respect should begin there." He turned to me. "Mrs. Hayes, you are free to leave. The court recommends follow-up medical evaluations purely for your recovery, not your capacity." I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. Margaret placed a steady hand on my shoulder. With her touch, something inside me eased, a quiet, trembling relief I hadn't let myself feel until now. Across the table, my children watched us. Their faces reflected a strange mixture: anger, disbelief, and something that looked very much like shame. The bailiff approached to escort them out for additional instructions. They didn't meet my eyes, not because they didn't want to, but because they finally understood I had seen through them completely. The judge gathered his papers, preparing for the next case. Court is adjourned. The sound of his gavel was not loud, but it was enough. Margaret began to wheel me toward the exit. The hallway outside felt cooler, brighter, almost too bright for the weight of what had just happened. But I welcomed the light all the same. I had walked into that courtroom afraid, unsure, trembling from pain. I was leaving with something I hadn't felt in a long time. My life was still my own. The ride back from the courthouse felt longer than it truly was, the kind of slow return that leaves space for thoughts to gather in unwelcome corners. Margaret sat beside me in the transport van, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her presence was solid enough to keep me from drifting into the exhaustion tugging at my edges. I didn't speak. Neither did she. Sometimes silence is the most respectful companion. When we reached my house, the driver helped me to the walkway. Margaret unlocked the new padlock the court officer had installed, the key clicking sharply in the quiet morning. The sound echoed in my ribs. I had always trusted that door. Now it felt like something had been taken from it and not yet returned. Inside, the air was still. Too still, as though the house itself had held its breath while I was gone. Margaret walked ahead of me, her steps careful but purposeful. She scanned the living room the way a lawyer reads a document, once for facts, once for intent. I didn't need her to say it. I saw it too. My home had been touched. Not violently, not obviously, but with the subtle fingerprints of people who believed they had already won. My desk chair was moved. A drawer left slightly ajar. A framed photo angled differently on the shelf. It wasn't the objects themselves, it was the certainty behind them, the casual entitlement of hands rummaging through a life they thought had already become theirs. "They've been here more than once," Margaret murmured. They were preparing for control. I lowered myself carefully into an armchair, feeling the weight of what almost happened settle onto me. "They didn't even wait," I said softly. "They didn't wonder how I was. They went through my things before the surgeon stitched the last suture." Margaret looked at me then, not with pity, but with the kind of understanding that feels like a hand placed quietly on the heart. "They acted out of greed, not love. Don't excuse it." I nodded, though a part of me still wanted to. Old habits linger. Mothers learn to forgive insults before the lips that delivered them have cooled. But this time, forgiveness felt like a door I had no intention of opening. I shifted slightly, the surgical pain reminding me of its presence, and scanned the room more closely. My knitting basket was overturned, its contents stuffed back carelessly. A folder that had sat untouched for years was now on top of the cabinet. My financial notebook lay half buried under mail that wasn't even mine. They had walked through my life as if surveying property. A tightness formed in my chest. Not panic, not sorrow, but a steady, deliberate anger, as clean as a sharpened edge. It did not come loudly. It came like understanding. "I'll need to change everything," I said. "Accounts, locks, access." "You will," Margaret replied, "and I'll help you. But first, you rest." I looked around my living room, the place where I had mended clothing, written holiday cards, folded blankets for grandchildren who stopped visiting years ago. It should have felt like home. Instead, it felt like a room recovering from intrusion. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet hold me. When I opened them again, I wasn't confused or afraid. I was steady. Steady enough to know that losing trust in your own children is a wound nothing truly heals, but steady enough, too, to know that I could still protect what remained of my life. The house was silent, but I wasn't. By afternoon, the pain from the surgery had settled into a slow, persistent throb, present, but no longer sharp enough to cloud my thoughts. Margaret insisted I rest, but I didn't want to lie down. Rest felt too close to surrender, and I had surrendered more than enough already. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, the familiar wood beneath my palms reminding me that this place, despite everything, was still mine. Margaret laid out the documents she'd retrieved, arranging them into tidy stacks. "Your financial advisor can meet with us over video," she said. "He offered to join in an hour." I nodded. I hadn't spoken to Daniel Winters in months, not from neglect, but because my accounts never required fussing. I lived modestly, had no debts, and kept things simple. That simplicity had always been my shield. Now it would have to become something sturdier. When Daniel's face appeared on Margaret's laptop, he looked genuinely relieved to see me upright. "Mrs. Hayes, I heard about the petition. I'm glad you're all right." "All right is a generous term," I replied. "But I'm here." He cleared his throat. "I reviewed your accounts after receiving Margaret's call. There have been multiple attempts to access your online banking profile in the past week." My stomach tightened. "From whom?" He hesitated, just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. "The attempts were made using security questions only your children would know. Birthplaces, school names, your mother's maiden name." Margaret exhaled slowly, her expression darkening. "They were preparing to take everything," she said. Daniel nodded. "If the guardianship had gone through, the bank would have transferred authority immediately. They preemptively tried to guess access pathways, likely expecting the court to finalize the petition quickly. It was one thing to imagine betrayal. It was another to see its fingerprints in a bank's digital logs. "What do we do now?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "We lock everything," Daniel said. "Every account gets new authentication, new passwords, and new security questions. We set monitoring alerts. And," he added gently, "we freeze any joint access, even emergency contacts. For now, no one but you and me will be able to move a cent." I nodded again. It should have hurt more to sever those ties. It didn't. For years, I believed that giving my children financial access, informal though it was, meant trust, support, connection. Now I saw it clearly for what it had become, a quiet invitation to be taken for granted. While Daniel walked us through each step, Margaret took notes. She was meticulous, patient, unshakable. I felt my world stabilizing one careful measure at a time. When the call ended, I sat back slowly, letting the room come into focus around me. The kettle on the stove, my worn recipe box, the faint smell of lavender from the sachet in the cupboard. Familiar things, unchanged, untouched. "They wanted more than guardianship," I said softly. "They wanted control." Margaret placed her hand over mine. "They wanted to replace your independence with their convenience." I looked down at our hands, hers steady, mine thinner than I remembered, but no longer shaking. "We've secured the accounts," she said. "Next comes the legal part. We'll make it impossible for them to try this again." I breathed out, slow and long. The betrayal was real, yes, but so was the clarity it left behind. And clarity, I was learning, was a kind of strength I hadn't used in years. Evening light was sliding through my living room windows when the knock came, sharp, hurried, and practiced in its impatience. Margaret was still sorting documents in the kitchen, but she looked up at me, waiting for my signal. I didn't need to speak. I simply nodded. I already knew who stood on the other side. When I opened the door, Peter stepped in without waiting to be invited, the way men do when they believe they still hold authority. His face was contorted with something halfway between anger and disbelief. I recognized that expression well. People wear it when the world refuses to behave the way they'd scripted it. "Mom," he said, shutting the door behind him. "What happened today was unnecessary. You embarrassed us in front of a judge." I let his words hang there, stale and heavy. "I didn't embarrass anyone," I replied. "I told the truth." He paced the room, his agitation building with each step. "You made us look like villains. Do you understand how serious this is? The judge filed protective orders. I can't even check on the house. I can't access anything." "Good," I said. He froze, turning toward me slowly. "Good? That's your response?" "Yes." He stared at me like he was trying to reconcile the mother he remembered, soft-spoken, accommodating, with the woman standing before him now, a woman he no longer recognized. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture he'd had since childhood, though age had turned it into something sharper. "You're being manipulated," he said finally, "by Margaret. She's putting ideas in your head." "I asked for her help," I replied. "You filed for guardianship without speaking to me. Without warning, I would be stripped of control over my own life." He waved this away with a short, irritated gesture. It wasn't about control. It was entirely about control. He inhaled sharply, preparing to speak, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't wait for him to finish the sentence. I stepped in first. "When," I asked, "was the last time you visited without wanting something? When did you knock on this door just to see if I was well? When did you offer help instead of asking for it?" His jaw tightened. "This isn't about the past." "It is exactly about the past," I said, "because that is what guardianship would have rewritten. The past, the present, and the rest of my life." He shifted uncomfortably. "We thought you were declining." "You didn't think," I said. "You assumed, because it was convenient." His face reddened, frustration flickering behind his eyes. "Mom, we're trying to keep things manageable. You're alone. You're aging. And you are my son," I replied softly, "not my keeper." For a moment, the room felt suspended, like even the air had paused to see what he would do next. But he had already exhausted all his arguments. What was left now was the truth he didn't want to look at. He lowered himself into a chair and put his head in his hands. "We can't afford the bills without your help," he said quietly, as though confession might soften the edges of deceit. Ah, there it was. The real reason, finally spoken aloud. "Then you'll have to learn," I said. He lifted his head, eyes widening. "You can't leave us like this." I folded my hands gently in my lap. "I'm not leaving you. I am simply refusing to be used." For a long time, he didn't speak. Then he rose slowly, as if carrying a weight he didn't want to acknowledge. "When you're ready to be reasonable," he said, "I'll come back." I met his gaze, clear and steady. "I'm already reasonable. That's the part you can't accept." He didn't respond. He simply walked out, letting the door close behind him with a softness that felt strangely final. Margaret stepped into the doorway after he left. "You handled that well," she murmured. I exhaled, feeling a tremor work its way through me, not fear, but release. I didn't want to hurt him, I said. You didn't, Margaret replied. You told him a truth he didn't want to hear. That's different. I rested my hands on the armrests, feeling the weight of the day settle quietly around me. For the first time in years, I had spoken without shrinking, and I wasn't sorry. Caroline arrived the next morning without calling first, which was unlike her. She usually scheduled her emotions the way she scheduled her meetings, tightly, precisely, always with an exit strategy. But this time, when I opened the door, she stood there with wet eyes and a stiffness that betrayed how hard she was working to hold herself together. "Mom," she said, her voice already trembling. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside. She entered slowly, as though the air inside my home might accuse her the moment she crossed the threshold. She looked around, not at the objects, but at the silence. Margaret wasn't here this morning. It was just the two of us, and the quiet was heavy enough to make her swallow twice. She sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. "I didn't sleep," she whispered. "I kept replaying the hearing. I kept thinking, you must hate us." "I don't hate you," I said gently, "but I'm not blind." She winced, as if the softness hurt more than anger would have. "We thought we were doing the right thing. Peter pushed for it more than I did, but I agreed. I didn't stop him." "That's the part I can't defend." I took the armchair across from her, lowering myself carefully. My abdomen still pulled when I moved, a reminder of how vulnerable I'd been when my own children made their plans. Caroline looked down at her hands. "You've always been so strong, Mom. You never asked for anything. That made it hard to know when you needed help." "I asked," I said quietly, "just not with words." She blinked, confused. "For years," I continued, "I needed understanding. I needed company. I needed to feel like more than an obligation that could be postponed or arranged around your schedules." Her mouth opened slightly. I could see the truth settling in her, slow and uncomfortable. "I didn't know you felt that way." "Because you didn't ask," I said. "And I didn't force you to look." Her eyes glistened, tears catching the light. "Mom, we weren't trying to hurt you." "But you did," I replied, not harshly, not accusingly, but with the simple weight of fact. "You walked into a courtroom prepared to take my life from my hands, not to help me, to control me. You decided I was easier to manage if I couldn't disagree." Caroline pressed a shaking hand to her forehead. "It sounds awful when you put it that way." "It is awful." She dropped her hand and stared at me. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking past me or around me. She was looking at me, at the mother she had slowly turned into a background figure, at the woman she assumed would always understand, always adjust, always make room for her priorities. "I thought," she whispered, "that if we handled things, it would take pressure off you." "No," I said. "It would take pressure off you. Don't confuse the two." A long silence followed. Not tense, just honest. A silence where truth finally had room to sit without being pushed aside. After a moment, she reached for a tissue from her purse, dabbing her eyes. "I'm ashamed," she said. "Truly." I nodded. "You should be." She let out a breath, shaky and thin. "Can we fix this?" "Not today," I answered, "and not by pretending it didn't happen. Trust isn't repaired by promises. It's repaired by changed behavior." She nodded slowly, absorbing every word as though they were heavier than they sounded. I want to try, she whispered. I know, I said. But understand something, Caroline. I won't bend myself in half again to make it easier for you to change. She looked down, tears dripping onto her wrist. I'm sorry, Mom. I believed she was, but apology alone was only the beginning. She didn't stay long after that. When she stood to leave, she hesitated at the doorway, waiting to see if I would offer comfort the way I always had. I didn't. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. She left quietly. And for the first time, the silence that followed felt like space I needed, not space I feared. The next days passed in a kind of steady, deliberate rhythm, each hour bringing something back to me that had been quietly taken. Strength, clarity, ownership. The house felt different now, as though it were slowly returning to its original shape after being bent by someone else's hands. Margaret visited every morning with a thermos of tea and a legal pad already half filled with notes. She was tireless in a way only older women can be, slow in movement, sharp in purpose. We're going to make this permanent, she said one afternoon as we sat at my kitchen table, the late sun warming the wood. Not just the bank freezes, not just the protective orders. Something stronger. I knew what she meant before she said it. An irrevocable trust. She nodded. Once it's established, your children won't be able to petition for guardianship again under the guise of financial concern. Your assets will be managed exactly as you designate. No interference, no access. I rested a hand on the table, feeling the grain press gently against my palm. And they'll know? They'll know enough, she said. The rest doesn't concern them. It struck me then how much of my life I had spent worrying about their comfort, their expectations, their feelings. And in return, they had not spent a single breath worrying about what stripping me of autonomy would do to mine. My heart ached, but not from longing, from clarity. The attorney arrived later that week, a soft-spoken man with silver hair and patient eyes. He greeted me with the kind of respect many reserve for younger, wealthier clients, but he gave it freely, without question. After reviewing the situation, he laid out the structure of the trust. Assets transferred, instructions fixed, access restricted. You will remain in full control, he said. Margaret becomes your successor trustee. Only if you become incapable, and only under medical confirmation from 2 independent physicians. I looked at Margaret then. She simply nodded, her eyes steady. No triumph, no eagerness, just loyalty offered without noise. We signed the documents at my dining table, the pen gliding across paper with the soft, decisive sound of a chapter turning. Each signature felt like a quiet reclaiming. This is mine, and this too. When we finished, the attorney gathered the papers with a small, satisfied nod. It's done, he said. Legally permanent. A strange stillness settled over me, almost like grief, but gentler. An acknowledgement that something had ended. Not my relationship with my children, that had fractured long before. What ended was the illusion that they would protect me simply because I had once protected them. After the attorney left, I remained at the table for a long moment. Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, rinsing cups that didn't need rinsing. I watched her hands, steady, capable, familiar. You've saved me, I said quietly. She turned, drying her hands on a dish towel. No, you saved yourself. I only pointed to the path. I shook my head. I wouldn't have had the strength. Strength isn't loud, she said. It's choosing to go on with your dignity intact." Her words settled deep, the way truth does when spoken without intention to impress. Outside, a light breeze stirred the branches near the window. Shadows shifted across the floor, soft and unthreatening. For the first time in weeks, I felt something inside me loosen. Not hope exactly, but a kind of peace that comes only when a woman stops waiting for others to choose her safety. The trust was complete. My life, what remained of it, was mine again. The letter from the courthouse arrived 3 days later, slipped neatly through the mail slot as if it were an ordinary piece of correspondence, nothing more than a catalog or a bill. But I knew its weight the moment I saw the seal. I carried it to the kitchen table, that old wooden witness to so much of my life, and sat down carefully, the familiar ache in my abdomen reminding me that healing, physical or otherwise, never happens in a straight line. Margaret was due to visit in an hour, but I didn't wait for her. Some things a woman must face alone, even at 74, especially at 74. I opened the envelope. The paper inside smelled faintly of toner and cold air. The judge's signature sat at the bottom in looping strokes, firmer than I expected. The content was brief, official, and without embellishment. The guardianship petition dismissed, the protective orders upheld, the file marked as resolved. But it was the final paragraph that caught my breath. An observation, almost gentle, in the judge's measured tone. The court acknowledges Mrs. Hayes's autonomy and the clarity with which she articulated her wishes. She retains full capacity and should be afforded the dignity of self-determination without interference. Dignity, autonomy, words so straightforward, yet so rarely given freely to women my age. I laid the letter flat on the table and smoothed the creases with my fingertips. My hands looked older than they felt, thinner, more lined, the veins more pronounced. But they did not shake, not this time. Across the kitchen, the morning light touched the edges of the cabinets, warming them slowly. I watched it move, soft and steady, and thought of how close I had come to losing everything that made me myself, not because my body failed me, but because the people who should have defended me decided instead to rewrite me into someone helpless. For years, I excused small cruelties. I filled the silence when they didn't call. I softened my needs so theirs could stand tall. I tried to be easy, agreeable, convenient. And in doing so, I disappeared in their eyes. The letter lay open in front of me like a mirror, not reflecting my children's failures, but my own fear of seeing the truth earlier. That is the quiet heartbreak of motherhood. You forgive them until the ground beneath you has worn thin. A sudden breeze pushed through the small gap in the kitchen window, rustling the paper. I reached out and held it down, not out of fear it would fly away, but because the gesture felt symbolic, steadying something that finally belonged to me again. When Margaret arrived, I didn't hand her the letter. I simply gestured to it, letting her read in silence. She nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful but unsurprised. "Well," she said after a moment, "that's closure." "It is," I agreed, "but it's also a beginning." She sat across from me. "How do you feel?" I took a breath, deep and unhindered. "Light," I said, but not in the way of relief. More like, the air finally matches my lungs. Margaret smiled at that, a small, approving smile. "You've earned that." I folded the letter, not carefully, not ceremoniously, but with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer fears it being needed again. I placed it in the drawer beside the stove, where I keep things I refuse to lose track of. Outside, a car passed by, slow on the residential road. The world was moving again, at its own unremarkable pace. But something in me had settled. Something firm, something necessary. The case was closed, and so was the door I'd been afraid for too long to lock. 2 days after the letter arrived, I found myself waking before dawn, long before the neighborhood stirred. The house felt still, not tense, not guarded, simply resting, as though it too had released something it had been forced to hold. The pain from the surgery was dull now, manageable. My legs were steady enough to carry me without fear of folding beneath me. And somewhere inside, a quiet resolve had settled, patient and unmistakable. "I think it's time," I said aloud to the empty room, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Margaret arrived shortly after breakfast, her coat buttoned against the chill, her hair neatly pinned as always. When she saw me dressed and sitting near the front door, she studied me for a moment, then nodded. "You're ready?" "Yes," I said. "I want my own words in the record, not theirs." We drove to the courthouse in her old sedan, the heater humming unevenly, the windows slightly fogged. I watched the familiar streets pass by. Quiet houses, trimmed hedges, the bakery where I used to buy cinnamon rolls for my children when they were small. I wondered whether either of them remembered those mornings. I doubted it. Childhood memories often fade gently for the child, but remain vivid and sharp for the mother. When we reached the courthouse, Margaret walked beside me, not touching my arm unless I needed her to. Respect, I've learned, is often just the right amount of distance. Inside, the building felt less intimidating than before. The echo of footsteps didn't unsettle me. The fluorescent lights didn't wash me out. I wasn't here to defend myself today. I was here to speak. We stopped at the clerk's desk. The young woman behind it recognized my name immediately. The case had stirred more conversation than I expected. She gestured toward a quiet corner with a small writing table. "You may submit your statement here, Mrs. Hayes. Take your time." Time was something I had learned to hold with care. I sat, adjusted my glasses, and set the pen to the paper. The words didn't rush from me. They came steadily, the way truths come once they've had years to sharpen. I wrote about the petition, about the lies, about waking from surgery to find my life rewritten by people who shared my blood but not my regard. I wrote about the dignity taken, the dignity reclaimed, but I also wrote about something else, something quieter. The years of small dismissals. The erosion that happens so slowly a woman barely notices it until the ground gives way. I didn't accuse them of evil. They weren't villains. They were careless, self-centered, thoughtless in the way adult children can become when they assume their mother will always be the softer side of the world. I wrote until my hand began to ache, and then I wrote a little more, not from anger, but from the deep, steady intention of being understood. When I finished, Margaret read the pages silently, then folded them neatly and handed them to the clerk. "These will be added to the permanent record," the clerk said gently. Permanent. The word settled over me like a final seal. When we exited the building, the sky was brighter than when we'd arrived. Warmer, even. We walked slowly down the steps. I felt each one in my knees, but none of them defeated me. Margaret glanced at me as we reached the car. "How do you feel now that it's done?" I considered the question, letting the air fill my lungs before answering. "Clear," I said. like my voice finally lives in the same world as my life. She smiled, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to let me know she understood. We drove home in comfortable quiet, and for the first time, the courthouse behind me didn't feel like a place of judgment. It felt like a place where I had reclaimed myself. The morning after I filed my statement, the house felt different, not triumphant, not victorious, just quietly aligned with itself again, like a picture that had hung crooked for years and had finally been set straight. I walked from room to room without rushing, letting my fingertips brush familiar surfaces: the mantel, the back of the sofa, the wooden frame of the old mirror in the hallway. Nothing had changed outwardly, but I had. And somehow, that was enough to make every corner feel newly my own. I brewed tea the way I always have, slowly, with the patience age so generously demands. As the kettle warmed, I opened the curtains and let the early light spill across the kitchen floor. Dust motes drifted through the beam, unhurried, as if they too had understood that nothing in this house needed to brace itself anymore. Margaret stopped by mid-morning with a basket of apples and a quiet smile. She looked at me the way people look at someone who has walked through a storm and come out on the other side still standing, still breathing, still herself. "You look rested," she said. "Rest comes easier when no one is trying to take your life from your hands," I replied. We sat for a while, not talking much. She read the newspaper. I sliced apples for a small tart. It was a comfortable silence, the sort that doesn't ask for anything. When she left, she squeezed my hand gently and told me to call if I felt unsteady. I told her I would, though we both knew I wouldn't need to, at least not for the reasons she meant. In the afternoon, I stepped outside onto the porch. The air held the faint chill of early evening, but the sun still lingered on the tops of the hedges. I lowered myself into the rocking chair that had belonged to my husband. The wood creaked familiarly beneath me. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm carry me. Forward, back, forward again. For a long time, I listened to the small sounds of life around me: a dog barking 2 houses down, a child's bicycle rattling on the pavement, leaves brushing each other in the wind. Everyday noises, ordinary things. How precious they felt now, untouched, unclaimed by anyone but me. I thought about my children, not with anger, not even with grief, but with a kind of quiet acceptance. They had made their choices. I had made mine. Maybe one day they would find their way back to something resembling respect. Maybe not. But I no longer needed to wait for that possibility. Some bridges must remain standing even when they're rarely crossed. Others must be closed to keep the ground beneath you safe. As the sun dipped lower, I opened my eyes and let the evening settle around me. The world didn't feel smaller, as I'd once feared it might. It felt clearer, defined, mine. I lifted my teacup, took a slow sip, and let the warmth linger. A woman spends so much of her life pouring herself into others that she forgets how steady her own hands can be when she finally holds something meant for her. My dignity, my voice, my life returned quietly, without ceremony, but returned all the same. If you're reading this, whoever you are, wherever you are in your own years, remember this one truth. Don't let anyone decide the shape of your life for you, not even the ones who call you family.